Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here. I figured it was time to get back to that hallmark of American literature, George W. Bush's 2000 campaign book, A Charge to Keep. Last time we read chapter 4. This time we're going to read the first chapter that I found interesting in this pile of shit. Chapter 3, What Texans Can Dream, Texans Can Do. I have chosen to retitle this on the screen as Robin Hood because Robin Hood fits, and because the Robin Hood plan, so called, is the central theme of this chapter insofar as there is a central theme. The chapter starts out with a clear message and story and then kind of veers into nothingness. It goes off to talk about George's friends, church appearances. Because of how disorganized and chaotic this writing is, we're going to be skipping over large sections of text. Just as a pre-warning, I tried to record this video 3 weeks ago. My voice went dead, I was an hour and a half deep, and I had about 3 or 4 more pages to go. Because my voice was cracking and just sounded like total shit, I couldn't finish it. I was in pain, sort of, and we had to abandon it. This is a 22-page chapter. There's a lot of filler here. I'm just going to get to the good parts, and I will tell you when I'm skipping stuff so you'll know. I'll try to provide brief summaries so you get an idea of what's here. If you would like to check in on what is in the book, this book is not hard to find. It's pretty cheap. Originally, of course, I had intended to read every word just to make sure that the full context was provided, but that just doesn't seem desirable given the length of this particular chapter. In the future, I will do the same thing. Short chapters will be verbatim, and longer chapters will feature some paraphrase and skipping. My cat has been yelling a bit tonight, so if you hear a faint animal noise in the background, that would be her. There's also an outside possibility that my dog, who has a bit of dog dementia, might wake up and start pacing or possibly even howling. Yeah, it's 2 in the morning, I think, and my animals are as nocturnal as I am. At any rate, let's get into the text of this literary classic. I vividly remember the night I first thought I might run for governor. I like how he begins with just a statement about himself and his personal ambitions. This is very much like Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. It was May 1st, 1993, a special election day in Texas. Voters were casting ballots to choose a new United States Senator to replace longtime Democratic Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who had been named Secretary of the Treasury by President Clinton. I like how sentences in his book actually have more clauses than just one. When he speaks, he has declarative one-clause sentences, but in his book sometimes he uses things like commas. Never anything fancy like a semicolon, but he'll throw some commas at you. And voters who were also casting ballots on a school funding referendum strongly supported by Governor Ann Richards and known as Robin Hood. I don't even know if that's a grammatically correct sentence. It barely is. I mean, using "and" to start a sentence is rarely good style. Why am I even bothering critiquing George W. Bush's writing style? It's not like this fucker's ever going to get better at it. He's just going to get Grammarly or something else, or a better ghostwriter in the future. He's not going to actually sit down and take the effort to become a better wordsmith. And now I'm going to debut something that will change your life forever. My George W. Bush impression. Back in 2008 or so, this was actually pretty damn solid, and I actually did this at an open mic night, and I got a few laughs. Okay, here it goes, my George W. Bush voice. As its name implied, the plan would have taken local taxes raised in property-wealthy school districts and redistributed them to poorer school districts in different parts of the state. To say the Robin Hood plan was not popular proved to be an understatement. Many Texans felt it was unfair to take local taxes raised in one community and redirect them to a different one. Plus, homeowners were feeling squeezed by rising property taxes, which have been soaring as real estate values and school enrollment increased across Texas. To deal with the latter point first, he's basically saying that Texans were struggling because Texas was doing well. And that has been a long-term problem from my understanding of Texas politics. Texas as a state contains an immense amount of wealth, but it usually ranks between 45th and 50th when it comes to, say, median income, life expectancy, childhood obesity, teen pregnancy, all of the categories where you don't want to be at the bottom. Or in some of those cases, they'd be at the top, but it'd be the ones where you want to be lower. And this is just because Texas is a land of immense inequality. And what Ann Richards' plan was trying to do was to redistribute wealth between districts. There are some incredibly poor places in Texas and some incredibly wealthy places. Not surprisingly, the places with all the money do well, and the places that don't have a lot of money tend to produce failing schools. That's how this system works. This sort of county school district system runs on money. And George W. Bush later in this chapter will acknowledge that, and acknowledge that that is the problem with school districts. But he doesn't want to actually do anything about it. He just wants to implement tests. So, yeah, spoiler for those of you who were not aware of No Child Left Behind. So now Laura and George are going to a hotel in Dallas to meet Kay Bailey Hutchinson. She was a senator at the time. And of course, Kay and I are long-term friends. And when she came up to speak, she asked George to introduce her. Back to the text. Page 24. I walked up on stage and the crowd of activist Republicans started hollering, "Run for governor," and "Governor Bush." I was surprised, but not completely so. You were not surprised. You just mentioned that there was an opening and that there had been previous chatter about you. Your dad had just been president as recently as 2 years before, or maybe like a year before. What surprise could there possibly be that activist Republicans would know who you are and expect you to follow in your father's footsteps? After the school funding proposition was overwhelmingly defeated, I saw Governor Richards interviewed on television, obviously upset by the defeat of the proposal she had so strongly endorsed. Despite her high personal popularity ratings and national celebrity as one of the stars of the Democratic Party, only 37% of the voters in Texas had supported her plan. 63% rejected it. In truth, I think those people should come forward and give us their plans. We are all, boy, eagerly awaiting any suggestions and ideas that are realistic, Governor Richards said. I remember turning to Laura and saying, "I have a suggestion. I might run for governor." So, what Bush does here is he shows that Ann Richards could sometimes be testy and sarcastic in a way that wasn't always endearing, despite having quite a bit of charisma. And he was also just showing that because this plan had failed so spectacularly, and because Texans were opposed to redistribution of wealth, he saw an opening for himself. This is still just all about him and his personal ambition. Usually, I would think, if you're running for president, you would want to lay out a vision or have a compelling reason to run. But in this chapter, at least, his compelling vision is that he saw an opening for himself. He thought that his opponent was committing political malpractice, and he thought that he could capitalize on it. This hardly inspiring stuff. Like I think I've mentioned earlier, this is basically what you got at Hillary Clinton in 2016. This is a critique I've leveled at her many times. We see this here with Bush. Of course, to be fair, the whole 2000 cycle was about as inspiring as a speech by your high school principal about becoming an IT pro. I was worried about my state, not only about how we paid for our schools, but also about how we governed them. We're doing it backward in Texas, I said thousands of times during the course of the campaign. Funding our schools locally, but governing them centrally. A state's most important responsibility is educating children, I believed, so I felt the state, not local property taxes, should be the primary source of funds for the school. Local property taxes are inherently unfair and unequal because property values are different in different parts of the state. This is actually something where George W. Bush proves that he is not a complete idiot and that he does understand how things work. And this is also one of the few times I can remember where he said something that I actually agree with. Um, yeah, states need to engage in some kind of redistribution of wealth to make up for the disparities between districts. Otherwise, you have extraordinarily uneven results in school. Um, yeah, I don't think he would go that far, but at least he does understand the problem. So, for those people who just said, oh, he was actually a good man, he was misled by his evil neocon advisors. No, look, Bush can be a moron at times, and he's not an erudite master of rhetoric, but he did know what was going on. He was not just a passive participant in all of his fuckery. I wanted children in every part of Texas to get a quality education no matter whether their school district was property rich or property poor. I also believed strongly in local control of schools. I knew that local parents and teachers and locally elected school boards were far more accountable than a distant centralized state education agency in Austin. So what he's proposing is something that sounds a little contradictory. If you impose testing standards but then give local schools the freedom to figure out how to meet those standards, you're still tying their hands, because ultimately they will be forced to teach to the test. And this will be a problem throughout this whole chapter and throughout all of his implementation of No Child Left Behind, both in Texas and later in the country. I was worried about crime, especially juvenile crime. This is a shift here. I guess he's explaining why he wants to be governor, or trying to. Random, violent juvenile crime was exploding. Gangs had turned some neighborhoods into war zones. Our juvenile justice laws were written for disobedient children of the 1950s, not the juvenile delinquents of the 1990s. So here what we see is that reversion to the conservative fantasy of the 50s, one, but also two, just this general rhetoric that was followed by a lot of centrist Democrats and pretty much all the Republicans of talking about super predators and all that kind of stuff. So this was a widespread thing that would not have been controversial at all at this time, and I think it's just interesting to observe that. So when he was putting this in the book, there's no way that any of his advisors would have thought this could be something that we might regret in the future. A number of states across the country had begun to realize the need to reform welfare, but Texas had not enacted any reforms and didn't have any plans to do so. Dependency on government saps the soul and drains the spirit of our very future, I said again and again. Okay, so basically his argument against welfare is that it's morally bad. That's it. So he doesn't try to understand the reasons why some people might need welfare. He just says, look, it's just not good for your spirit. It doesn't make you independent. You'll never be able to discover the joy of bootstraps if you have the government backing you up. Arguing for placing time limits on welfare benefits and requiring recipients to work, train, or learn a skill in return for the taxpayer's assistance. I think it's funny that he doesn't acknowledge the real leader on welfare reform. It actually was Bill Clinton, the guy he was running to replace in 2000. This was something that had a broad bipartisan support at the time. Conservative Democrats and Republicans were pretty much lockstep on reforming welfare. So once again, here George W. Bush is saying something that is actually mainstream at the time. Although like this sort of moralistic angle to it is sort of uniquely Republican and goes in with his compassionate conservative thing, where his whole mantra is that a compassionate conservative is someone who cracks down on everything like a regular conservative, but then they show these people personal respect and they might pray with them or talk to them, deign to be with them. That's basically what a compassionate conservative is, as he defines it in the conclusion of this book, which we will eventually read. And I was worried about our state's business climate. Articles in major business publications had essentially described Texas as tort heaven. Liberal court decisions had resulted in an unfair legal system tilted in favor of personal injury trial lawyers, unfortunately making Texas a great place for people to sue one another. Tort reform was basically where Republicans wanted to make it impossible to do class action lawsuits. So when a company would release a product that would harm or kill a number of clients, Republicans wanted to make it to where each individual victim would have to try to fight a corporation's power alone and unaided. Basically, they wanted to make it where corporations could get away with murder, literally. And they blamed it on trial lawyers, like those horrible people who have a job and actually perform a useful social function, even if they are personally assholes. Okay. I wanted Texas to be a great place to do business, an entrepreneurial heaven, where dreamers and doers felt comfortable risking capital and creating jobs, not a haven for frivolous lawsuits. Yeah, of course, I imagine if he had been given enough space, or if it had happened yet, he would have talked about the McDonald's coffee incident, which actually was a legitimate case. The old woman who spilled coffee on her lap suffered severe burns and almost died. And I don't know how many of you are coffee experts, but you actually do not have to have water that hot to make coffee. You don't have to endanger your life to create a tasty morning beverage. Most of all, I worried about changing the culture. A culture I described as saying, if it feels good, do it. And if you've got a problem, blame somebody else. Because, that's how he had spent his youth, and he turned out pretty fucking terrible. I mean, George W. Bush was a drunk. Full stop. Not only that, but he grew up rich, he fucked up a number of times, and he was always able to come back. He was always able to blame the booze, or blame one of his companions, or just get away with it without blaming anyone. So he is speaking of his own past. This is moral projection. And it's again the sort of 50s versus 60s culture war bullshit that boomers were obsessed with in the 1990s, where conservatives wanted to get back to the fiction of the 50s, and liberals wanted to keep the social reforms of the 60s. It was a really dumb debate because both decades were just oversimplified and made into something they weren't. A lot of times when people will talk about the 60s, they should really have included the 70s, because that's really when all of the social change took place, was between the 60s and the 70s, but I digress. And also I like how he's just saying that, let's just move on. The warning signs of cultural crisis are everywhere. Boys father children and walk away to let others deal with the consequences. Young girls, children themselves, are having more and more babies. Criminologists warn of a new generation of super predators, kids who are fatherless, godless, fearless, and jobless. Black kids. Yeah, this is what we call a dog whistle. Pretty clearly what he's referring to are minorities. This was part of the stereotype that a lot of conservative people had about minorities at the time. And George W. Bush is basically using the coded language of the era that had been first perfected by Newt Gingrich back in 1994. Too many of America's marriages end in divorce, and 1/3 of the babies in our country are born out of wedlock. I had seen our country's culture change dramatically during my lifetime, so I was convinced it could change again. I believed we needed to usher in an era of personal responsibility so that our state would be more prosperous and more peaceful. The thing about morality is that it is not directly linked to economic performance. Jeffrey Epstein was very wealthy. Was he moral? Obviously not. Donald Trump, very wealthy, not moral. George W. Bush, wealthy but not moral. Some countries have prospered, others have not. Is Haiti poor because it's immoral? I highly doubt it. This is just this this weird conflation of morality and prosperity to obscure the waters and make people think that morality is a thing that actually matters or that can be quantified in some way. Not only that, but if you know anything about the history of morals, the first thing that you know is that morals are constantly in flux. Moral values and cultural norms are constantly changing. And to think that you can direct the change of morality by just talking about personal responsibility and, condemning super predators is just ignorant at best and completely idiotic at worst. That's not how morality works. The Emperor Augustus, the greatest politician to ever live, full stop, actually tried to change the morals of the Roman ruling class, and he failed. He was able to convince people, however, that his rule as emperor was not a monarchy and that the republic lived. And he couldn't change the moral values of the people around him, even if he did convince them of such an obvious fiction. If Augustus can't do it, neither can you. So the next time you hear an American politician talking about how we need to change our culture, just know that they're completely full of shit and that it is literally impossible to direct the change of the culture. Cultures are formed by all of us. There are many, many, many competing influences, and there's no way to fully shape a culture outside of a totalitarian system. And even in places where they've had some limited authoritarianism, such as Iran, they still have not convinced everyone that that is the way to go. I mean, Iran has all kinds of underground clubs. Many people there are still very much interested in Western culture. You can't impose cultural conformity. That will not happen. It does not work. Okay, that's the end of my rant. Not many people gave me much of a chance to win. My mother told me I couldn't beat Ann Richards, then was a little put out with me when I gleefully shared her opinion with the world. When reporters would ask me about my chances, I would turn it into a joke, saying, "Even my own mother doesn't think I can win." My friend, Charlie Younger, said I was crazy, and that I should wait 4 years because I could never beat Ann Richards. To this day, okay, this is what it says word for word. To this day, I suspicion you had a secret poll, that you knew something the rest of us didn't. You were so certain. Younger now jokes. Don Jones thought my loss in a congressional race in 1978 spelled the end of my political career. Okay, there's just some shit about people talking about how they were surprised that he ran. Laurel was surprised because he loved baseball so much that he would be willing to abandon it. Let's go down to the bottom of page 26. The campaign began to gather momentum as I talked with more and more people. Premier Texas political consultant Karl Rove had been a friend of mine for years, since the early 1970s, when my dad was chairman of the Republican National Committee and Karl headed the college Republicans. I guarantee you, if you looked back at those years when Karl Rove was in charge of the college Republicans, there's no way that their admission numbers went up. If you went there and you saw Karl Rove's face, there's no fucking way that if you were on the fence, you would join the Republican Party. I mean, let's just keep it real. Also, fun side note, I dare you to look up a picture of Konstantin Pavlovich, the brother of Tsar Alexander I. He looks exactly like Karl Rove, but in a Napoleonic-era uniform. So, next time you study the Napoleonic Wars, just remember that Alexander had his own Karl Rove, too. Karl is the Lee Atwater of Texas politics, a brilliant strategist and student of political history, whose successful campaigns and candidates have helped transform Texas into a Republican state. Lee Atwater was a famous political strategist of the 80s and 90s. He had a profound reason for becoming a Republican, namely that there was no talent on the Republican side, and everybody else with any kind of talent or charisma was going Democratic. So he decided, hey, this is an opening, I'm just going to be a Republican. I don't even know what the hell that entails, but I know how to get laid and I know how to get elected. So I will teach these people to be charming and to win over voters. And that was the Lee Atwater story. Then he died of cancer, the end. I just say all that because I don't think many people know who he is today. Since he's been dead since the 90s, his fame has diminished, and now Karl Rove has taken his place as the major political genius, if you will, of the political right. He started working on the political plan, and the Austin headquarters of his direct mail company became temporary command central for the fledgling Bush campaign. We planned an announcement tour for November. Oh, another note, when he talks about Karl Rove turning Texas red, there was also a lot going on nationally which contributed to that. It wasn't just Karl Rove's solo genius as a political strategist. The South as a whole had been going red since the Civil Rights Act. and certain places fell earlier than others. Texas held out a little longer than a lot of other places, but ultimately it was going to go red. It didn't hold out as long as, say, North Carolina or Kentucky or something like that, but, you know, it did, and the 90s was the time. Bush was the beneficiary of that movement. Okay, there's a long story on page 27 about Israel Hernandez, a great friend, someone who signed up for his campaign, and he loves Israel, he's got a great work ethic, blah, 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 but one time Israel was late and George W. Bush taught him a lesson by leaving him behind when he got on a plane. It's really boring, not much going on. They also talked about family and business and politics and religion. Okay. So, page 28, Israel has walked out of that first interview, and again, wonderful person, great friend. As Israel walked out of that first interview, Vance McMahon walked in. Vance came to me by way of Stanford and a Houston law firm. As I mentioned earlier, another Bushism is to mention anytime he knows someone who went to an Ivy school. So if anyone went to an Ivy League school, Bush will have to mention it to show that he is connected with the best and the brightest. People just like him, the creme de la creme of American society. Let's see, there's more about some people they knew. Vance knows some people, Karl Rove knows some people. Okay, the interesting thing about Vance is that he asked Bush what his ideas were, and he basically interrogated Bush. Bush then gave him an answer about how education should work. The state's role is to set clear standards, hold local districts accountable for results, and measure progress. So he has claimed that he wants to really set local districts free, but at the same time, they're not actually free, because if they don't perform, then they get punished, and the only way to perform is to pass this test. But because the test is so specific and, gauges sort of objective knowledge, you have no freedom aside from teaching to the test. Anyway, I told Vance I thought the juvenile justice system had been totally ignored. We needed to turn it around and send the right message to redirect kids' lives. I told him I was not interested in the status quo, that I was interested in different ideas and wanted my policy director to think outside the box, to find and develop innovative solutions to our state's problems. He was looking for a policy director. That's what Vance McMahon is. Okay. And then after Bush got done ranting about his policies, he asked if he wanted the job. Vance was really into it. And then basically Bush is soft-bragging that Vance said that he was impressed that Bush just gave that spiel rather than asking him questions. And then Bush tries to make it out like he was some sort of business guru because he said, I wasn't buying, I was selling. Alright, okay, here's something. As director of my policy operations, state government, as well as on the campaign, Vance has repeatedly proven the merits of that decision. I later learned that Vance had taken a year off between Stanford undergraduate and University of Texas Law School to work in an Episcopalian literacy program, a tribute to his character. So another thing that Bush does is if someone is Christian or has faith, he will mention that and then say, well, obviously this is a good person. I mean, we've never seen a bad person who believes in God. We've never seen a Christian serial killer or anything like that. Anyone who has faith is clearly just above and beyond everyone else. And this is something that is a very common hallmark of Bush rhetoric. He talks a lot about faith and other people's faith. He wants to hear about your faith. It doesn't come up as much as his friends, but it's pretty damn close in terms of frequency. Okay, some shit was going on. They're planning their campaign. Rove and Vance and these other people. I met with them in small groups, sometimes one-on-one, discussing ideas, asking questions, picking their brains. I set the philosophical framework. Vance's job was to flesh out the ideas, develop specific changes to the law and policy initiatives. In other words, Bush would sit in the room and say, So guys, what's the idea here? What kind of strategy are we going to employ to get these policies and laws passed? Turd Blossom, you go first, and then Mr. Magoo, you follow up with some critiques and you write all that down. From the beginning, we knew it was important to be substantive. I don't think George W. Bush ever thought that. I had never held office before, and I knew people would be skeptical. Ann Richards was personally popular, but I was convinced her policies were not. I wanted to take Texas in a very different direction. I outlined my values in the speech kicking off the campaign. To stand for office, you must stand for something, I said. I believe in the value of hard work. Without jobs, there is no hope. And all public policy in Texas has to be based on the fact that entrepreneurs and small business people are the backbone of our society and the basis of hope. I believe the best way to allocate resources in our society is through the marketplace, not through a governing elite, not through red tape and overregulations, not through some central bureaucracy full of experts who think they know more than we do, but through the actions of free men and women in the marketplace. So apparently the people who run the markets are not elite. And apparently people who spend their lives studying public policy are not actually experts, and they don't actually know more than your average Joe about how to manage Social Security or whatever. Good to know, I guess. I believe all people should be held responsible for their individual behavior. All public policy should revolve around the principle that individuals are responsible for what they say and do. I believe the family is the backbone of Texas society. I believe results matter. Our leaders should be judged by results, not by entertaining personalities or clever sound bites. So when he says people should be held responsible for individual behavior, what he's talking about is that people who do wrong should be punished and the state shouldn't help people, period. That's really what he's talking about. And when he goes against people having entertaining personalities or clever sound bites, you might think that sounds odd because Bush later ran as the guy you'd have a beer with. He was a personable guy. He seemed charming, especially compared with like John Kerry or Al Gore. But he was at a disadvantage vis-a-vis Ann Richards. If you've never seen Ann Richards, just look her up on YouTube. She's been dead for a while, but she has a lot of great clips. She was very engaging. She appeared in Ken Burns' The West, and she also was very witty and clever. Now, she could be acerbic, and that sometimes worked against her, but, she was pretty compelling and entertaining. Certainly more than Bush. So Bush in his first race was actually at a disadvantage in terms of charm. Alright, Bush is talking about education again. Nothing new or interesting. Page 30. Okay, crime laws, still page 30. I talked about tougher laws to crack down on crime, especially juvenile crime. Penalties for juveniles who use a gun in a crime will be tougher, much tougher. We will have zero tolerance for discipline problems in our classrooms. We must assure our teachers that they are allowed to teach and guarantee students their right to learn without disruption or fear of violence. But we can't just throw discipline problems out on the streets, so that is why I want a new kind of school, tough love academies and boot camps, and as the last stop, more beds in our juvenile justice system. I talked about the need to slow down the dramatic growth of government. So this is mostly, I guess there's substance here, but it's also a lot of get tough and get results rhetoric that is coupled with policies that are unlikely to actually achieve the desired results. What I offer to people, let me start over. What I offer to people of Texas is a modern day revolution. It's a revolution of hope, change, and ideas. It can only be launched by a new generation of leadership taking responsibility, and it can only succeed with your support. This literally could have been ripped from an Obama speech or from a Bernie speech. Now, in either case, it wouldn't match the speaking style of Obama or Bernie, but I can imagine one of their supporters at a rally saying something like this. And a lot of people freak out and act odd about Obama talking about hope and change or Bernie talking about a revolution. Yet Bush used all of that rhetoric in a speech, and he was considered just a common sense, hard-working, Republican, conservative, American hero guy. So there is a double standard when it comes to rhetoric and the use of words. We had a strategy to visit rural areas of the state throughout the early half of the year before the fall, when I would have to make news in major media markets. I would travel all day, visit a school and a factory or a courthouse, then have a fundraiser at night. I love campaigning, especially in small town Texas. The fundraisers were really the key here, as we'll see. I enjoy meeting people and shaking their hands and listening to their stories about their lives. I don't particularly like raising money, although it's a necessary part of the campaign, especially against a well-funded incumbent. Now, what we'll see is that he is about to contradict what he said about how he loves to meet people. In the early days, it was tough going, person to person, one individual at a time. So, although he claims to be a people person who loves talking to people and hearing their stories, he wasn't really that appreciative of the people who gave him 10 or 20 bucks. No one gave me much of a fighting chance, and not many people want to put money into what they suspect will be a losing cause. I'll never forget going to see Don Carter, a wonderful man who was the owner of the Dallas Mavericks basketball team. I gave him my pitch, talked about why I was running, and how I wanted to change Texas. An hour later, he pulled out a checkbook and said, "I'd like to help you." He wrote the check, handed it to me, and said, "Good luck, son. There are no limits on campaign donations from individuals for state elections in Texas, and Don is a wealthy man." From watching him write upside down from across the desk, I thought the check was $10,000. But as I walked out the door, I looked down and saw that it was actually $100,000. I had to restrain myself because I felt like jumping over the desk to hug Don Carter. I told him, "I'm honored, I'm humbled, I'll always work to make you proud." To this day, Don Carter has never asked me for one thing. In fact, when I called to ask him to bring his family and grandkids down to Austin to visit and have lunch, I practically had to beg him to come. This is the problem of money in politics in a nutshell. Bush has just admitted that because this one guy, Don Carter, who, by the way, was an incompetent NBA owner, he had the Triple J Ranch and he allowed that to break up, and the Mavericks under his ownership never achieved a goddamn thing. Anyway, Bush just admitted that he was beholden to this man, much more so than any of the poor schlubs who'd given him 10 bucks. This is why we cannot have money in politics and not have a corrupt system. If you have money in politics itself is corruption. I remember in 2016, a lot of Democrats who should have known better, because Hillary takes corporate money, they said, "Hey, it's different with her just because, look, she's different." It's not. All politicians are like this. George W. Bush is not the exception. I'm actually grateful to him for just putting this in writing and making it as clear as day. That moment was a big boost. And after the first of the year, I began detailing a series of substantive policy proposals. Let's see, more stuff, just details about punishing kids, sweeping welfare reform packages, able-bodied people have to get a job, attend school, train for work. Here's one that I find objectionable. Require participating mothers to identify the fathers of their children so they could contribute to their support. The problem with that is that women who are in abusive relationships or had to escape a man would then have to be subjected to that man again. George W. Bush's emphasis on keeping the family together would subject some women to abuse. There are situations that need to be escaped sometimes, and George is not recognizing that at all. So this, as a welfare reform, is not smart on any level, and it's stunningly idiotic. Emphasize personal responsibility by requiring welfare recipients to sign an independence pledge, contract pledging to stay drug-free and keep their kids immunized and in school. So I guess Bush is not an anti-vaxxer. That's cool. I proposed education reforms and tort reforms to improve the business climate in Texas. The problem with tort reform, of course, is that that is not good for the average citizen. We have to have torts around, or otherwise people will die of mesothelioma and have no recourse to acquire justice. All right, policy operation was on target. I wanted a tough but fair campaign manager, so he hired some idiot named Joe Albaugh from Oklahoma. Let's see, he was impressed by Joe's character because he asked Joe if he had any faults, and then Joe said he used to have a temper. And he says he's never seen Joe actually lose his temper, even though he knows he's been angry before, so Joe's a good man and a friend. Margaret LaMontagne, a friend of Karl Rove's, blah, blah, blah. Political director, executive director of the Republican Party of Texas, Karen Hughes, joined the team. She, by the way, is the co-writer of this book. Reggie Bashir worked as one Republican governor's press secretary to man the operation in Austin. It's a great team, blah, blah, blah. All right, page 33. But the critics continued to disparage my chances. They ignored the substantive proposals I was making. I was a lightweight treading on a famous name, they said. I was going to lose my temper, blow up, and lose the election. And everything I proposed would cost at least $1 billion. That was the Richards campaign's standard response to any new policy proposal I made. I was derided as shrub, a clever but derogatory term meaning son of a bush. So, this gets to the heart of why Ann Richards was not successful and why George W. Bush was able to win the governorship. Richards actually ended up campaigning to George Bush's right. He proposed some policies, the policies he just outlined. And rather than proposing alternatives, she instead just balked about the cost of what he wanted to do. So we were in an odd situation where you actually had a Republican who wanted to do stuff and a Democrat who just said no to everything. That is against the dynamic of how American politics have worked in the modern era. And it's no real surprise that Ann Richards lost. Why? People vote for Democrats to do stuff. That's why I've said on many occasions, if you're a Democrat and your campaign slogan doesn't include a verb, you're guaranteed to lose. Republicans, on the other hand, can run on some vague stuff. Bush actually had some policies here, but mostly it was that rhetoric of personal responsibility, restoring morality, and that kind of stuff. That's what a lot of Republican voters respond to. The Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again," works because it sounds like he's doing something. And it has a moralistic thing going on with it. I mean, there's not much substance to it, but it sounds like something that would be exciting. Governor Richards had always been mildly disparaging about my candidacy. In March of 1994, she told reporters in Dallas, "This is not a job where the federal government gives you job training funds so you can learn as you go. You can't be shaving one morning and look at yourself in the mirror and think, 'I'm so pretty, I'll run for governor.'" But I was determined not to respond in kind. The reason why he doesn't respond in kind is because he can't. George W. Bush knows that this was a damning indictment. He has always considered himself to be a good-looking dude and someone with a famous name. She hit him where it hurts. He was running on the fact that he had name recognition because of who his dad was and because he, at the time, was reasonably young and attractive. That's what his campaign boiled down to. He was running Beto O'Rourke style in many ways, except with much higher name recognition. That's effectively what was going on. Texas politics has a reputation for being a contact sport, but I was not suiting up for that game. He was a cheerleader, not a football player. From the beginning, I treated my opponent with respect. I don't like negative campaigning, unless it's against the gays, black people, or people who oppose the war on terror, in which case it's totally cool, but or a war veteran like John McCain. That's also fine to be negative there. But otherwise, and I refuse to engage in it. Campaigns should be about ideas, and I had substantive ideas to change our state. The kind of ideas that would excite Dave Rubin, no doubt. I talked about my proposals, which I presented on my timetable throughout the campaign. I criticized Governor Richards' policies, but I would not criticize her personally. Again, she was sharp-witted and sharp-tongued. Had he attacked her personally, she would have chopped his nuts off on stage, and it would have ended his life. So it stood out in late August when Governor Richards derided me as some jerk, then said she really hadn't. You just work like a dog, do well, the test scores are up, the kids are looking better, the dropout rate is down, Governor Richards said in a speech in Texarkana. And all of a sudden, you've got some jerk who's running for public office telling everybody it's all a sham and it isn't real and he doesn't give you credit for doing your job. So far as he is concerned, everything in Texas is terrible. This is basically kind of like the dynamic with Hillary and Trump in a way, where Richards was a little overconfident and definitely underestimated her opponent. But Bush's analysis that he won because she was rude, that's totally not it. She might have hurt herself a little bit by being more negative than Bush, but the thing is, the reason Bush won is because he did have some policies, whereas Richards just ran on Bush is terrible. As I mentioned before, and I can never say this enough times, Democrats have to run on action. People vote for Democrats to do stuff that will make their life better. If you're not running on anything as a Democrat, you're guaranteed to lose. If you have no economic message as a Democrat, you cannot win. It's that simple. Alright, so she was trying to deny that she had called Bush a jerk, blah, blah, blah. Then somebody asked him about it, some reporter. I laughed it off, saying I couldn't remember being called names like that since I went to grade school at Sam Houston Elementary. The incident said a lot, it seemed to me. It said my opponent was frustrated at facing a surprisingly tough challenge from someone who had never held elected office. It indicated she felt her re-election should be easy, that perhaps she thought she had earned and deserved it before she had. Alright, here's something more interesting. We had always worried that Governor Richards would launch an early television offensive and would hit the airwaves with the substantive, forward-looking agenda that would reinforce her popularity before my campaign was able to get a foothold. Exactly. My point exactly. Bush knows that when Democrats actually run on substance and they talk about helping common people, that's when they're dangerous. When Democrats run on bullshit, they're pretty much unelectable. It's that simple. And as I've mentioned before, when it comes to policy and understanding the world, George W. Bush is not smart. But when it comes to electoral politics, the horse race aspect, he doesn't even need Karl Rove. He understands this stuff. He understands it perfectly well. We worried we would not have the money to respond if she went on television in the spring or early summer. It never happened. She didn't begin television advertising until August, and her first commercial was vague. When I started my series of issue advertisements in August, the incumbent found herself responding to me and my proposals for welfare reform and education and juvenile justice. Heading toward fall, the campaign was building momentum. Then came the picture that went around the world. Me in blue jeans, khaki shirt, and hunting vest, holding a shotgun in one hand and the wrong bird in the other. I have to admit, I've never really been to Texas. I don't understand Texas culture all that much. But the following is this long-winded account of how both of them did fake promotional hunting trips. And George W. Bush fucked his up by getting the wrong bird. I think Ann Richards did something where she didn't shoot, she couldn't hit anything. Anyway, this is mostly bullshit. I'm just going to skip to the parts that are interesting. We're starting at the very bottom of page 34 and we'll move on from there. On page 35, when we're talking about guns, George W. Bush says, I also believe that government should pass laws such as instant background checks to help keep guns out of the hands of felons and juveniles and others who should not have them. Governor Richards has been criticized for vetoing a referendum that would have allowed Texans to express their opinion on a conceal and carry law. I argued that Texas should have this law. I knew that many law-abiding citizens, including many women who worked late at night or alone, were carrying weapons to protect themselves. So when it comes to the issue of instant background checks, this is something we still haven't gotten. Something that the NRA now derides as a liberal extremist opinion. But yet we have George W. Bush running on this in 2000. And I think like 70% of the country right now would like that. I don't know why there's even a controversy about background checks. I feel like that's pretty obvious precaution when you're selling someone an instrument that might take a life. Seems reasonable to have strong background checks in place. As for concealed carry, Bush already had a way to try to pass this politically that would try to appeal to liberals, because he knows that liberals really enjoy doing things that are in the interest of, say, women and minorities. So he made concealed carry a women's issue. Now, while that's a weird framing, it actually is pretty politically clever, especially in a place where, there's some debate over guns, but if you make it a women's issue, then some of your softer Democrats are going to break away. So, again, like I said, when it comes to just horse race politics, Bush is actually pretty damn sharp. Okay, I felt strongly that people who were carrying weapons should be registered, undergo background checks, and be trained in gun safety. Okay, he got it done as governor. A lot of states have this, by the way, and there is mandatory training, which of course is a really good thing that there's a training requirement. My grandma, I think, carries a gun now, which is scary because, well, we suspect that she might have the very early stages of dementia, and she has a gun that doesn't have strong safety features. Anyway, let's not get into that. Alright, more about the dove thing. We're on page 36 now. We're still not having anything substantive. It's just Bush and his advisors freaking out over shooting the wrong bird. They were looking for one kind of bird, shot another that happened to be endangered. A kildee was the one they shot. So they paid a fine. They consulted a justice. The fine was $130. They turned it into a little political stunt. A political reporter, one of the senior ones, said that this was really going to hurt the campaign. Apparently they were super stressed out for like an entire day or two or three, and they were on edge because they thought that they had just killed themselves. Alright, his daughter made a joke about it on camera. Everybody thought it was funny. He was gaining momentum going towards the October debate, the only one both candidates had agreed to. Now we're on page 38, and we're finally back to stuff that isn't completely a waste of time. Alright. Debates freeze a campaign. News coverage focuses on the build-up and preparation. Nothing else gets through. The sponsors, the Dallas Morning News and Cara Public Television, had insisted on a dual format, a series of questions from a citizens panel, followed by questions from a panel of state political reporters. When the citizens began their questions, it seemed to me as if every anti-welfare reform liberal in Texas had been placed on that panel. It didn't seem exactly representative of the Texans I had been talking with on the campaign trail. Yes, because it turns out that there are people in Texas who aren't Republicans. Shocking, but it's true. Not to mention, Texas also has a lot of poor people. Poor people are the beneficiaries of welfare. There are also people like social workers who work with poor people. They would be concerned about these proposals. Why would it be surprising to you that initiating a major reform would cause people to ask questions? Why is this an issue? Like, what the fuck? How is this a surprise to you or an insult to you? Okay, someone asked Governor Richards about her agenda for the next 4 years. She gave a response which prompted me to reply. I don't know what the response was. He doesn't list it. The campaign speech we just heard could have been 4 years ago. I told the audience that either nothing was accomplished or Governor Richards' vision for the future was the past. So basically, again, she wasn't running on anything. And George W. Bush exposed that. If you're a Democrat and you're not running on something, your voters are not going to be excited. Independents will not respond to you because you're not demonstrating strength. Independents, in many ways, at least the ones who are somewhat centrist and can go either way, don't really have any firm ideological commitments. I hate to say it, but they're really like dogs. They respond more to strength than to the words you use. They respond to tone, not substance. And if you're a Democrat who doesn't want to do anything, you're not going to portray yourself as strong. You're not going to give out that you know what you're doing, that you're someone who should be followed. You're going to sound like you're waffling because, well, you are waffling. Both sides claim victory, no major mistakes, no knockouts. He held his own with an experienced political official, blah, blah, blah. Okay, parade, rural Texas, Democrat country, but a lot of people supporting him. Visited a black church in Houston. He spoke after Barbara Jordan, who was a congresswoman who defended the Constitution during Watergate. She basically said she supported Richards, got a big applause line. Then Bush spoke after her. He bombed. I don't remember what else I said. I don't think I won over many votes, but I think I did earn a little respect. RESPECT. It doesn't come with votes, but it means a lot to me. I added that last part. With a little more than a week to go, we began hearing a surprise announcement. Governor Richards was having a news conference, reporters told us, and her staff was saying it could change the dynamics of the race. I was in Houston for an event when we got the word. Ross Perot, who I believed had been instrumental in defeating my dad in 1992, was endorsing Ann Richards. He was visiting his parents. His mom, of course, hates Ross Perot. As lifelong Republicans, they are not big fans of anybody in a third party because they think of them as spoilers, not as legitimate political actors. Anyway, so Ann Richards got the Perot endorsement, and then Bush told a reporter later, she can have Ross Perot, and I'll take Nolan Ryan and Barbara Bush. The endorsement didn't affect any votes. I think the election had already been decided, but based not on endorsements or personalities, but on issues. But later he said that Ann Richards had come off horribly because she had attacked him personally, whereas he had come off as much more pleasant. So that is a personality thing. That's a contradiction in the text. We were counting down the days in a campaign of joy as we described our travel team, feeling good about the possibility of pulling off an upset. Okay, we're back in election day, hometown of Dallas. Page 40 now. He didn't have his driver's license and voter registration card, but when he got to the polls, no matter, the election judge told me. They were pretty sure they could identify me. I spent the rest of the day waiting, calling people to thank them, checking in with campaign headquarters to see if they knew any more than I did. So apparently, voter laws are supposed to prevent voter fraud, according to Republicans. They're really uptight about this. They're afraid that people who aren't citizens might be voting. And usually, if you're just a regular person, if you show up without your identification, you're not voting. If you don't have all of it, you're not going to be allowed to vote. And even in Ohio, that's the case. And they'll really put you through the ringer if you just move somewhere and you have an out-of-state license. You will go through some real bullshit. But George W. Bush just walks in and they're like, we recognize you, it's fine. There are other people who might be known there, but they would not get this VIP treatment, I guarantee you. They would be forced to cast a, quote, provisional ballot, and then their vote would just be cast in the trash. Around 4 o'clock, a friend of mine from a TV network called and said something, you're going to win 53-47. He got on a plane to fly to Austin, but he was still nervous, you never know. All right, Marriott Hotel, Satellite Trucks, Joe Alba, Karen Hughes. All right, expos look great. More friends, a bunch of family friends. Evanses, Youngers, O'Neills, Johnsons, next door neighbors from Dallas, Mark and Patty Langdale, cousins Craig and Debbie Stapleton, campaign chairman Jim Francis and his wife Debbie, my longtime administrative assistant Sherry Waldy, my friends Tony Garza and Senator and Mrs. David Sibley, Israel, and some of the campaign staff. Did you know that George W. Bush has friends? He hasn't really made that clear in this book, but the fact is that George W. Bush has a lot of friends, and those friends are important to him, and he is important to them. You need to know that. My political guru, Karl Rove, was on several phones at once, constantly getting the latest numbers. Megyn Kelly, of course, was not there to ask him if those were real numbers or fake, made-up, make-believe Republican numbers. Okay, alright. Room exploded. He wins, hugged his daughters, kissed his wife. Began preparing to go downstairs to declare victory and thank my fellow Texans. Campaign proved to be a power of ideas. Oh, wait, this is funny. Ultimately, the campaign proved the power of ideas. I was outspent by my opponent, but I won with the largest margin of any gubernatorial candidate in 20 years. The biggest swing was in East and Central Texas, conservative Democrat country, the areas where Ronald Reagan attracted the votes that became known as Reagan Democrats. So basically, all the work was done before you even ran. That area was already poised to turn red. The South as a whole had been going red. Reagan had really laid the groundwork. The area, as you mentioned, was conservative, so they are likely to support a Republican. And if you ran a more appealing, more substantive campaign, no shit that conservatives would look to you as more appealing than a Democrat who isn't doing anything. So it's not the power of ideas. A lot of this seems a lot like Ann Richards just ran a shit show of a campaign. I mean, both of the campaigns were worried about shooting the wrong bird. I mean, who gives a shit? Okay. Thanks to the hard work of my good friend and chairman Jim Francis and my campaign manager Joe Alba, I ended the campaign with $500,000 still in the bank. So after the whirlwind transition, he was at inaugural day. He awakened with great anticipation, page 42. And my mother handed me a letter from my dad. To this day, it brings a lump to my throat. I'm going to try to read this letter with a George H.W. Bush voice. He's a little harder to do, but we'll see if I can pull it off. Dear George, these cufflinks are my most treasured possession. They were given to me by Mom and Dad on June 9th, the day in 1943 when I got my Navy wings at Corpus Christi. I can't do George H.W. Bush. He sounds like a dork, though. He's like a dorkier version of George W. Bush and less Southern. Just look up Dana Carvey for reference. I want you to have them now, for in a sense, though you won your Air Force wings flying those jets, you are again, quote, getting your wings as you take office as our governor. I remember way back to that day in 1943. I remember the feeling of excitement and joy. I remember other feelings too. Expectation was one. I even felt a little twinge of anxiety. Maybe apprehension is a better word. I felt the same thing years later when I was sworn in as President of the United States. Maybe you'll have some of those same feelings. That would be very normal. But you are ready for this huge challenge. You'll do just fine. You'll be a strong, honest, caring governor. Maybe it will help a tiny bit to know that your mother and I will be at your side through good times and bad, right there, always, with total confidence in your ability, and with an overflowing sense of pride in you, our beloved oldest son, and in our wonderful Laura, too. You have given us more than we could ever have deserved. You have sacrificed for us. You have given us your unwavering loyalty and devotion. Now it is our turn. We love you. It was signed in his handwriting, devotedly, Dad. On the bottom, Mom added a note. We are so proud of you, Mom. So, George W. Bush, in an effort to appear human and to disguise his war crimes and other horrible failings, will often try to give touching anecdotes about his relationship with his parents. This is an age-old George W. Bush trick. I think that the feelings there are genuine, but just because someone has a close relationship with their family or with their pet or whatever the fuck, it doesn't mean they're a good person. And that's something we always have to remember. I'm sure that Fred and Donald Trump had a close relationship in one way or another, but clearly That doesn't mean that Donald Trump didn't do some crooked shit when he was a businessman. Same deal. Throughout the day, as throughout my life, I was touched and comforted by the power of their love. At noon, my hand on Texas legend Sam Houston's Bible, simple and worn. I took the oath of office and became the governor of Texas. Okay, his inaugural address, he welcomed the governors of the Mexican states closest to Texas, highlighted the importance of friendship with Mexico, thanked Governor Richards, basically just rhetoric about being a Texan and, you know, thanking God that you live in Texas. Usual sort of state pride rhetoric that is pretty insufferable if you don't live in that state. Groundwork for legislative session. I share my predecessor's knowledge that progress is only possible with cooperation with the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker, and the legislative bodies they represent. I am eager to work with you, Governor Bullock and Speaker Laney. Our task is to serve the great people of Texas, to serve them well and constantly and unstintingly. Together we will do that. I share the energy of one newly scrutinized by Texas. During the campaign, I sought to let you know what was in my heart by speaking plainly and simply about my vision for our state's future. It was that philosophy and vision which were endorsed in November. Texans can run Texas, I told my fellow Texans. I will ask the federal government to return us the power to set our own course. My guiding principle, I said, will be government if necessary, not necessarily government. So basically, this is a kind of clever inversion and softening of Reagan's government is not the solution, government is the problem. So this sounds a lot more reasonable and moderate. And that was sort of George W. Bush's brand, is that he wanted to come off as someone who had conservative principles, but he wasn't an ideologue, and he would be willing to admit when government should be used. So again, clever when it comes to marketing and horse race politics. All right, more about his policy initiatives that we've already heard. My enthusiasm for our mission is exceeded only by my confidence that we can succeed. And when we do, those who feel left behind will have new hope. Those who have grown cynical will begin to care, and our children will grow up in a more prosperous and more peaceful state. The history of our special land tells us this, that what Texans can dream, Texans can do. To be your governor is an unimaginable honor. Thank you for your confidence in me, and God bless Texas. He started the day with the church service. A hymn that he selected was A Charge to Keep I Have. I guess that's where the title of this book came from. It's just a hymn written by Charles Wesley. No one cares. He gives the full text of it. And now the last page of the chapter, mercifully, page 45. Several weeks later, Joe and Jan O'Neill called. They owned a beautiful oil painting by W.H.D. Corner entitled A Charge to Keep. Had been a wedding present from Joe's dad. The painting was inspired by the hymn that had been sung at my inaugural service, and Joe and Jan wanted to loan it to me if it would fit in my state office. It did fit, and it was there to the time of writing. In April, he signed a memo, and he told people, when you come into my office, please take a look at the beautiful painting of a horseman determinedly charging up what appears to be a steep and tough trail. This is us. And on the picture, the lead horseman actually closely resembles George W. Bush himself, which I imagine was a huge factor in selecting this particular painting. Let's see. The last paragraph. The hymn has been an inspiration for me and for members of my staff. A charge to keep calls us to our highest and best. It speaks of purpose and direction. In many hymnals, it is associated with the Bible verse, 1 Corinthians 4:2. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I guess since that's the end of the chapter and that's a pretty terrible ending, I'll go back and read A Charge to Keep at the bottom of page 44. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never-dying soul to save, and fit it for the sky. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill, oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. And of course, George W. Bush's master is not God, but rather the corporations, and he served them very, very well, both as governor and as president. I leave you with that, and next time when we resume this series, we will look at another chapter in this magnificent work of American political history. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. Good night and good luck.